Today we're going to be discussing two people who are developing, you might say, a Kantian perspective in a somewhat different way throughout the 19th century. They're two hugely influential figures, one working in Germany, who still has a huge influence on continental philosophy, and then one working in the United States, who continues to have a large influence on American philosophy. So, in a way, their ideas go nicely together. Peirce and other pragmatists tended to actually be part of Hegel's societies that sprang up all around the United States during the 19th century discussing the philosophy of Hegel. And so he was well aware of his predecessor that we're going to be talking about today, and develops his view as a kind of variation of Hegel's idealism. So let's start with Hegel's idealism. You see here the plaque that that marks his gravestone. Born in 1770, died in 1831. What was Hegel doing? Here you see him pictured with his students. He was perhaps the last great philosophical system builder. There have been some philosophers throughout history who have commented on particular topics, who have developed views on this subject or that subject. But some, and especially the ones we study in a course like this, are people who build grand systems, who have a comprehensive view of things. Plato is one such person, so is Aristotle. And we've looked at some others, Descartes, Leibniz, especially Hume. There's a whole tradition of such people leading up to Kant, and then to Hegel. Hegel is maybe the last of these, who really has a very comprehensive view of everything. Now, in some ways that's unfair. There are some 20th century philosophers who come close to this in producing massive works, but Hegel might be the last one to really do philosophy in the old style, in that sense. Now, in another way, he does things in a dramatically new style. He writes in German, invents a lot of new terms, even more so than Kant. He's very difficult to read. If you think Kant is hard, Hegel is miserable to read, in my opinion. I think his ideas are extremely interesting, but the writing is really almost impenetrable. And that has turned a lot of people off. In any event, he gives us a dynamic form of idealism. So he's following in Kant's footsteps and takes that transcendental idealism and makes a number of alterations to it, which make it more dramatically idealistic, and sets the stage for the rest of 19th century philosophy. So we're going to look at the way in which he does this. Here is a little picture of Kant's theory of mind. Suppose I am thinking about an object like a triangle that I see. According to Kant, there's something out there that is actually stimulating my faculties of sensation. I really can't say what it is. It's the thing in itself. And the categories don't really apply to it. A priori knowledge doesn't apply to it. So I can't really know it at all, Kant says. But nevertheless, and in fact in the first edition he says, the thing in itself causes my sensibility to react in a certain way. And then he realizes, wait a minute, causation is one of the categories. The categories don't apply to things in themselves. So I can't really officially say that the thing in itself causes my sense of organs to respond in a certain way. So he drops that from the second edition. But in any event, something does something. I can't even say that officially, really. I can just say, my sense organs respond in systematic ways. So presumably they're not just making it up. They're responding to something, perhaps. And so I have this thought, that's a triangle. My concept of triangularity is somehow involved in this. I recognize that as a triangle, as satisfying my concept. And I construct mentally this object of appearance, this phenomenon, which is the triangle as I perceive it. Now that's something I can know about, and in fact I can know some things about it a priori. However, I can't really know anything about the thing in itself. Well, Hegel looks at that picture and says, wait, there's something weird about that picture. Because Kant, in a section of the Principia called The Refutation of Idealism, says, strictly speaking, I'm not an idealist. Why? Because I think there must be a thing in itself. There's got to be something that is stimulating the organs of sense to do something. And yet, of course, he can't really use that causal language officially, so it's an odd section. But Hegel looks at this and says, wait a minute, you told me there's a key thing here, this thing in itself, which is distinct from the object of appearance, the phenomenon, and I can't know anything about it. And in fact, the categories don't apply to it. But then, what is it doing there? So here's Hegel's first criticism of Kant. He says these noumena, these things in themselves, actually play no role in the system. They're supposed to, in the intuitive idea, that's what, well, the world is doing something that causes my sense organs to respond. And yet, I can't actually talk about that because the pure concepts of the understanding do not apply to these things. And so I can't talk about causation. I can't say that things in themselves stimulate the sense organs because that's causal talk. That's not appropriate. These things don't fall under the categories. In fact, the things in themselves can't even really be said to exist because, after all, existence is a category. So I can't tell you they cause things to appear as they do, that they cause my sense organs to react in a certain way. I can't actually even say that things in themselves exist because existence is a category, causation is a category, they apply only to the objects of appearance, not to the things in themselves. And so Hegel looks at that and says, well, wait a minute. By the light of your own theory, you can't actually say anything about these things. And so they can't play any role in your theory. You've introduced something that you admit you can't know anything about, you can't talk about. Well, what's the point of that? So Hegel gets rid of it. Get rid of the thing itself. It's not doing anything. You can't even say it really even exists. And so let's erase it. But now if we erase it, of course, what do we have? We just have the mind constructing the world. We have the mind producing the objects of experience. And then Hegel says, look, there's no gap anymore between the appearance and the thing in itself. So we might as well just say that things are the appearances. That's what we're talking about all the time. And yes, they're thoroughly mentally constructed. They're projected. But to the extent that we talk about things, that's what we talk about. There's no such thing as the thing in itself because by Kant's own lights, there's no way to say anything about it. So that's the first move. We get rid of the thing in itself. Now, we do the same thing to the self. Just as Hume saw that there's a connection between our conception of the unity of objects and our conception of the unity of ourselves, so Hegel says, well, the same thing applies here. Now, in Kant, there's a distinction between what he refers to as empirical consciousness. That's just this succession of thoughts, perceptions, feelings that are going on in my mind consciously, and then the underlying self that is actually synthesizing the data of sense and producing that experience for me. He says, well, unlike Hume, there can't be just nothing there. It can't be just this bundle with nothing tying them together, nothing doing the bundling. There's got to be something doing the bundling. And so in Kant, that thing is called the transcendental unity of apperception. I am really identified with that thing, this transcendental unity, the underlying unity that has to be there for experience to be possible for me. But now, Hegel says, well, here's the problem. There's a weird contradiction in a way, or it looks like a contradiction, because actually everything that's part of the world of appearance is governed by deterministic physical laws of things. And yet the transcendental unity of apperception, me, my own will, I am free. And how is that possible? It's like everything going through my mind is completely determined, and somehow I'm free. That's a weird thing to get your mind around. But forget about even that problem. Hegel says, look, there's this idea that there's something underlying here that is doing the bundling, that is actually providing the unity. That's something like the theater in Hume's metaphor, but of course theaters have projectors. And there is one mind, this transcendental unity, that is actually gathering up all the data of sense, organizing it into experience of objects. But now Hegel says, well, wait a minute. That division doesn't make any more sense than the split between things in themselves and phenomena in general. After all, really, this empirical consciousness, just the collection of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, that's something that is something like, well, the objects of appearance. That is myself as I appear to be. Then, just as Kant says there must be a thing in itself, so there must be some transcendental unity that's actually doing the bundling, that is the self, that is organizing experience in some way. But hold on a second, I can't say anything about it either. It is a noumenon, it's a thing in itself, it's me and myself, you might say. And I can't talk about that, I can't know about it, it's not something I can even say exists because the categories don't apply to me. So, Hegel says, get rid of that too. So now I've gotten rid of the world, and I've gotten rid of me. All I have are appearances. Well, okay, yeah, I have a Simpson clip here, but because it was cutting out all the other images in my slideshow, I had to put it in a PDF, which means you can't see it. Sorry about that. If you actually go and download hegel.key, you can see this, but you'll lose most of the images. Anyway, okay. Kant's rationalism is one that looks like this. There are innate ideas, okay? There are these pure concepts of the understanding that are really built into us. and built into you, me, every human being, just as human. These are part of our cognitive heritage. We are born with certain abilities, and these abilities are innate in us. They are things that we don't gain from experience. Our mind is simply structured in a certain way. And so we're structured in order to see the world as consisting of objects that are connected together, relate to one another. We see events as connected in relations of causation, and so forth. All that's built into the mind from the beginning. Correspondingly, there are these synthetic a priori truths, these laws of the understanding, that are similarly built into the mind from the beginning. I'm expecting events to be connected causally. I'm expecting objects to have properties and standing relations, and so forth. But the thing is, those apply only within the realm of experience. Those aren't things that apply to things in themselves. They don't apply to the me and myself, this transcendental unity. They apply only within the realm of experience. So as we saw last time, I can actually know something about the world of experience a priori, but I can't know anything about things in themselves at all. Now Hegel says, wait a minute, you're assuming that we can have universal and necessary knowledge by virtue of having these universal and necessary a priori concepts and a priori laws. But why should I think that human beings have always organized the world in the same way? Why should I think that every human being has the same a priori concepts and the same laws, and that this has persisted over the whole history of the human race? So he says, look, the laws, the a priori concepts, all of that would have to be constant over all of human history and all throughout humanity. But he says, why should we expect people to construct the world in the same way at all periods of time, in all places? And so he ends up advocating historicism. He says, actually, the way in which human beings have constructed this image of the world changes over time. Now, not quickly. It's not like, whoa, today I thought there were objects. Tomorrow, I'm not going to think they're objects. I'll just look around and say, oh, what a swirly mass. It's like a big bowl of oatmeal. No, it's not going to be like that. But gradually over time, Hegel's point is, these things can develop, they can change. People can start thinking in a Newtonian universe about every object connected to every other object. In ancient Greece, did people think that all objects were connected to all other objects? Probably not. They didn't have a concept of gravitation. They didn't have this idea that the force that some particle here exerts on some particle on Alpha Centauri is real, even if it's negligible, and it's very, very small, but it's not zero. And so after Newton, people start thinking about things in different ways, and they adopt different principles of the understanding. So Hegel's point is that these things change. Now, was there really a time when humanity didn't think of the world as consisting of objects? I don't know, maybe not. But there are certain other kinds of categories, certain other kinds of principles that might vary over time. Whether there's anything that remains constant throughout all of human history and all of humanity, well, that's a different question. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So in short, Hegel is saying the way we construct the world is not just given to us all at once, and that every human being throughout all of time does it the same way. The way we construct the world shifts over time. It develops systematically over time. And so he says philosophy, like every other form of thought, should be something we expect to vary with the historical circumstances. Was ancient Greek science the same as modern science? No. Was ancient philosophy the same as modern philosophy? No. And so he says philosophy is really its own time, raised to the level of thought. What philosophy is an attempt to express a certain worldview that reflects the way people are constructing their experience at that given point in time. It changes because people construct the world differently over time. Well, at this point he tells us this grand story. Okay, this grand story of Geist, of spirit, as it develops throughout the history of the world. He sees the whole history of the world as a history of spirit, as it's manifested over time, as it develops over time. Spirit starts out in a certain way, and then it develops, and it grows, and eventually it attains this full development in a state of absolute knowledge. So it's a dramatic story of spirit, or sometimes it's translated as mind. It progresses through a variety of these stages to achieve absolute knowledge. Now, a lot of people think it's an utterly fanciful story. It's like, yeah, you're just making this stuff up. And so I've seen philosophers criticize all this and dismiss it, saying, yeah, he has these, sort of mystical laws about this mystical being, the world spirit. But he's trying to tell us a story that I think we can put in slightly different language. He's trying to say, I can't tell you, in the way that Kant tried to, what is really a law of the understanding that applies to all people at all times. But I can tell you something about the principles that people adopt at a given time. That's philosophy as we've ordinarily known it. I can also tell you something about the dynamic principles that drive the changes in the way we construct the world. Those dynamic principles are something like constant principles. They, he thinks, really can be formulated in a general way. And although the way we construct the world changes over time, these principles that drive the changes in our construction, those don't really change. So he says there is a kind of truth that Kant, you might say, was very general, that we could actually get. But it's not what he thinks it is. It's not something that establishes universal and necessary knowledge for all times and all places. What it does is describe the dynamics of consciousness, you might say, the dynamics of our thinking about the world. And so he says, what remains constant is not really a set of innate ideas. It's not a set of innate laws of the understanding or principles. Instead, it's these dynamic principles that drive thought, that govern the development of our thinking about the world. Well, now, what are these very high-level, very abstract, dynamic principles that govern not the way we think about the world at a given time, but the way in which our patterns of thinking about the world change? There are a number of these in his very long and difficult book called The Lie. But the most popularly known is something called the thesis, antithesis, synthesis pattern. Now, some Hegel scholars say, well, I can't even find this literally in Hegel. But most Hegel followers find this in Hegel. And so it's become something strongly identified with his philosophy, even if when you look at the text, you think, where are people exactly getting this? Here's the general idea behind it. And he does give us lots and lots of examples of this, by the way. So this is a picture that makes sense to me, but I've tried explaining it for years and no one else ever understands it, so I'm going to skip it. Anyway, here's the pattern of this. Maybe, gosh, I can't resist. I've got to try it one more time. Okay. The idea is, yes, we construct the world in different ways over time. Those are the things at the bottom. So our theories about the world change, our attempts to construct the world change, and we change the principles we're using. But there may be these dynamic principles. If you want to think of them, there are theories about theories and about theory change. Those remain constant. That's like the red box. And so these dynamic principles are at a level, you might say, one step above the ways in which we actually construct the world and the principles we use in describing the world. These are our principles about principles and about changing principles. And they remain constant. How do I do? Does that make sense? Oh my gosh, you're the first class ever to think so. Okay. So here's this thesis, antithesis, synthesis pattern. All right? We've got this thought that people formulate a thesis. And really here it isn't just usually one person who thinks of this. It's something that many people think. But in any event, it might be one person who first thinks it up. In any case, there's a thesis. So people become convinced of something about the world. But then it's not fully accurate. It doesn't really match the way the world is, and various problems arise. And so at that point, someone proposes the antithesis. They say, well, maybe that's false. What about this? Here's a different and sort of opposite way of thinking about the world and constructing our experience. But that really doesn't work out very well either. And at that point, people try to recognize the truth that's in each of these, but also the inadequacy that's in each of these, and formulate a new way of seeing things in the synthesis, trying to capture what is right in each of the thesis and the antithesis. So here's an image I like to use in thinking. The world is complicated. It's really messy, okay? And it's very difficult to come up with a theory that explains everything about the world. So imagine that we're trying to describe that river, okay? And we can only do it with straight lines. Well, suppose our thesis initially is that, okay? The river basically goes like this. By the way, I think this is southern Utah, in case you're wondering where this is. So Colorado before it gets to the Grand Canyon. But in any case, you're looking at this and you think, well, okay, that's sort of the line that the river takes, but it's not exact, right? The river is winding around like this. And so our thesis line in the upper left there, well, that's very approximate. And so we start looking at that and thinking, well, wait a minute. You know, the river is over on that side of there, and then it goes off to the right side of it, and then it goes a little bit to the left, then off to the right again. That's a pretty grubby picture of where that river actually goes. Well, then the antithesis is to say, well, then what if we drew it in a different place? What if we drew it a bit there? That's the black line that's in the far right. We might think, well, what about this, the way of talking about where the river goes? Well, it captures some things that were left out of the thesis, but it doesn't get it right either. There are lots of things that can deviate from that one. And then someone says, well, what if we went somewhere in between, in this case, the synthesis, that red line sort of goes down the middle. And of course, it's not right either. It forms a new thesis, and then we start dealing with the inadequacies of it. But the thought is, the world is this incredibly rich, infinitely complex place. Every time we propose a theory, we're simplifying. And so we propose this simplification, and it may do good things for us, but various anomalies arise, problems arise. So somebody says, well, that's not quite right, the right analysis. What about this one? And then we analyze it and realize it too has anomalies and contradictions and faces problems and counterexamples. And then we try to put them together, capture the strengths of both, just as we did right at the outset. In fact, the inspiration for this is Socrates' method in those early dialogues, where he says, aha, maybe courage is standing and fighting and not running away. This purely external behavioral idea, that doesn't work out. Then he says, well, what if it's a wise endurance of the soul? That's a purely internal idea. And that looks like the opposite. That's something like the antithesis. And then when we were thinking about it, although it doesn't really happen in the dialogue, we can think, well, how could we do better? There better be an external component. Courage has something to do with behavior. But on the other hand, it can't just be external. We have to know why somebody's doing it. So there's an internal part too. And that's something like formulating the synthesis. Say, look, Locke's was right. There has to be an internal part in his second definition. But he's also right that there has to be an external part in that first definition. And yet either one alone doesn't do it. We have to in some way put them together. And that's something like that synthesis. So in the thesis, we look at this way of putting things together, but we do encounter contrary evidence, counterexamples, anomalies, contradictions, just as that first definition of courage is standing and fighting and not running away does. Then we propose an antithesis. So we say, well, what if it's purely internal, a wise endurance of the soul? But then that's only a partial truth too. So it turns out it confronts contrary evidence, counterexamples, anomalies, contradictions. We get problems there as well. And so what do? Well, we try to capture what's right in each to formulate this synthesis. So we transcend it. The German term here is aufgehoben, which means we don't just combine them, so a little of this and a little of that. We really transcend them in a sense, try to capture what's right about both, but also formulate things in a new way. As you all did actually when you proposed a definition of something like, accepting risk for the sake of a greater good. Acting in spite of risk, in spite of dangers for a greater good. That's a definition of courage that actually builds in something internal as well as something external and serves as something like a synthesis. Well, here's another major principle of Hegel's. Thought is essentially social. How do I actually think about the world? How do I decide how I'm constructing it? How do I formulate any of these principles or anything? Well, if it's not in terms of innate ideas that are just built into me as a human, these things change over time. That's the historicism. But also, how do I learn them? I learn them by learning the language. And so, how do I learn the language? From the people around me. So, thought is really essentially social. The ways in which we think are really borrowed from those people around us. We learn how to think by learning to speak. And we learn to speak by being around other people and learning the language they have. That's not to say we can't formulate new and original thoughts, but it is to say we build on something that is provided by the community around us. And so there's a sense in which the basic categories of thought are coming from our language. And our language is coming from a community of people we're part of. So thought is really essentially social, according to Hegel. Well, what does this mean about the self? It too is a kind of social achievement, actually. At one point, Lisa Simpson says, some philosophers have thought of the self as something that is an achievement, something that you have to actually gain through hard experience and suffering. And that's Hegel's view she's describing. Hegel rejects all things in themselves, including that noumenal self, the transcendental unity. I have to actually build a self. And indeed, that's what the phenomenology of spirit talks about. It talks about the self being constructed in part through my interactions with other people. And so I go through a variety of stages, and it's a complicated story. If I were teaching a whole course on Hegel, we'd spend lots of time on it. And it's very interesting. It leads up to a state he considers unhappy consciousness, where really I am alienated from myself, I'm divided from myself, but in the end, I overcome that alienation. And I do it by recognizing other people as agents like me, and realizing that they see me the same way. So it's sort of like, wait, at first I'm just trapped inside my head, and I can't get out. But then I realize, wait, you're in the same spot I'm in. You're just like me. And you realize, hey, I'm just like you. And then I see and you recognize that I'm just like you. And yet, we all become selfies. Okay, now that sounds a little bit silly, but the way this is actually portrayed is very powerful. In a sense, you feel this depth of alienation. You feel as if the world is out there separate from you, and you're in here, and somehow you don't really have anything intrinsically to do with that world. You start by trying to involve yourself totally in the world, and you find yourself lost. Then you back away and try to gain who you are in yourself, and you realize that doesn't work either. And it's only in communion with other people, recognizing them as agents like you, and recognizing that they see you as an agent just like them, that you actually feel part of things and overcome that alienation. Yeah?
Could this be a nuisance of, like, modern art? Since we're all in this sort of condition, not being able to find ourselves, how do we make each other find ourselves?
All right, that's a great question. He says, isn't this a bit like the blind leading the blind? Right? If I don't recognize myself as this kind of being, as part of a community of beings, how does it ever happen? Hegel says at some point, I just recognize this. I realize, in fact, Sartre has a version of this where I see someone in a mirror, and I realize, wait, they're looking at me in another mirror, and we like recognize our mutual recognition. Okay, that's one way in which things can go. But actually, the existentialists like Sartre say, we can never really fully overcome this. We confront that alienation, and there is no escape. And for just the reason you're worried about, if I don't really think of myself as a self, then how can I value you as a self and recognize your recognition of me? There's a lot of mutual recognition. So like, wait, I recognize you as a self, and I recognize that you recognize me as a self, and then you recognize that I recognize you as a self, and then we both recognize that, and we get this kind of common recognition. And it's a beautiful story in a way, except that how do you make that first step? If I don't think of myself as a self, how can I think of you as one? And if I don't, how can I recognize you as recognizing anything about me? It's very strange, right? If I don't recognize my own selfhood, how can I recognize you recognizing my own selfhood? And so the existentialists typically say, yeah, this way out won't work. And we're just stuck in alienation. We're stuck in unhappy consciousness and we can't get out. And so it can feel like the blind leading the blind, and when that happens, what happens? Well, people just go in random directions and don't really go anywhere, and you might think that's what happens here. So I think Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, other existentialist philosophers do see this is just a trap you can't get out, and think Hegel is way too optimistic about this. But for our purposes, we can say, well, at least the idea is supposed to be that we do this socially, that there is some way of actually recognizing one another's recognition of one another, and in that way actually fully becoming selves and recognizing ourselves as a part of a community. You might say, well, put this in a silly phrase, I mean, it's sort of like, it takes a village to become a self. It takes people around you to actually make yourself fully integrated and overcome that alienation between you and the world. You've got to feel like you're part of something. You've got to feel like you're part of a group. And they've got to feel like you're part of that group too. Well, philosophically for our purposes, something that's very important here is that Hegel rejects what he calls immediacy, something that later philosophers have referred to as the myth of the given. The idea here is this. In Kant and in earlier philosophers, there are two very distinct stages of gaining knowledge. There's perception, and then there is conceiving of those perceptions. So I just had this visual image of a triangle, for example, and then I say, hey, that's a triangle. And those are two separate processes. I see this image, and then I categorize it, I classify it conceptually as a triangle. Or I see you, and at first I just perceive you. And then I actually think, there's a person. Or maybe I think, there's Jane, and there's Bob. And those things are matters of recognizing that image as falling under a concept. But those are two separate parts. Hegel says we can't actually draw that distinction. The way in which we perceive the world is so infused with concepts from the very beginning that I just immediately perceive that as a triangle, or I immediately perceive you as a person, or if I know you, I immediately recognize you as Maximilian, or Sarah, or whoever it is. And so my concepts of the world just shape the way I perceive the world. There's no way of dividing sensibility from understanding, to use the Kantian terms, or perception and then conceiving of the world in a certain way.